So I am speaking with Jennifer DeForest, who has just been a part of a really interesting group discussion regarding the use of data to some extent. It's a little more complicated than that, but the use of data in change and decision making, in responding to the educational setting. But Jennifer leads the partnership group at the YouthTruth and has spent a decade in the classroom, has led schools in California and New York, and she also worked for the California Association of Independent Schools, which is how I first got to know her. CAIS is very often an influence on NYSAIS, and we hope NYSAIS in turn on CAIS. So we have a very good relationship with them. When she was at Harvard's Graduate School of Education, she served as a co-chair for the editorial board of the Harvard Educational Review. And I'm going to begin by asking you to talk a little bit about YouthTruth and your work.
So YouthTruth is a child of the Center for Effective Philanthropy. So we were born of a partnership between some Harvard professors and the Gates Foundation. And the idea was that if you're investing funds in an intervention, be it a nonprofit organization related to education or not, you should go to the end users and find out whether or not that innovation hit. So over time, it became clear that the instrument that we developed for considering whether or not there was efficacy around interventions with schools had a lot of value to school people. So it took off on its own, and we created this team within the Center for Effective Philanthropy called YouthTruth. And our motivation, our mission is really about lifting student voice into policy making and into change in schools. So we measure all those things, all those non-cognitive inputs in school that matter so much for the outcomes of kids. Belonging, peer culture, relationships with teachers, kids' perception of whether or not they're being challenged in their classroom. We do that in valid and reliable ways. We codify it. We bring that back to the community, and then we create processes with the community to do the analytics on that data, and that becomes an engine for continuous improvement in schools.
So could you give us an example, like maybe choose one of the many schools I know that your group works with, as to the focus that emerged as a result of this collection of information, and perhaps any change that occurred?
Sure. They really are, in most instances, incremental changes. So rather than taking this idea of like a grand research project where we have to design it and it needs to go through institutional review and we need to have a control group set up, this is the idea of practical measurement and continuous improvement. So all of the questions that are part of our core student instrument are built up into these factors that we know from the research are predictive of student outcomes. So I'll give you just one example. So engagement, right? We know that students' engagement in their learning is linked to their motivation and tips into their experience in school, and then can predict academic achievement, right? We know that from all kinds of studies. The MET study done by the Gates Foundation, for example, showed that kids' perceptual data around their experience in school was more predictive of their outcomes than classroom observations even, right? Okay, so we have all of these questions that roll up into a factor around engagement, so a school can start to track over time whether or not they're engaging kids, in which kids they're engaging more effectively. You drill down into that factor, and you've got the 5 or 6 questions that help to assess whether or not engagement is strong or weak in the school. So you might have one about, for example, does my teacher make me think hard and explain my answers. I'm not getting it right, but there's a strong question about that, which is really about metacognition. So you might have a weak score on that. So then all of a sudden you know, oh, I need to work with my teachers on strategies for metacognition. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to find good research-based ways of doing that around thinking routines or whatever it happens to be. And then I'm going to see next time we do the assessment whether I get purchase on that question. So each one of those questions can become done well, used well, thoughtfully as like a tool belt that the educator then has to be able to pull out and tinker around the edges for school improvement.
So now, you've worked mainly in the public sector?
Yeah, almost entirely with public schools. So public school districts, charter organizations, and then we also work with philanthropic foundations when they have a specific project that they're working on with schools, or we have an initiative where we're building student voice. So the goal of the foundation is to bring agency into schools, and so we bring those schools together and we work with them to help kids develop that muscle around analysis of data, and the outcome that we're going for is really student agency. So those are our main projects. We have been around for a decade. We've surveyed over 1.2 million students, and I think I can count on two hands the number of private schools we've worked with. Mm-hmm. So I've been out, I've spoken with various private school organizations, shaking the trees, trying to make sense of why is it that private schools aren't doing this work? Are we not effectively reaching out to that sector, or is that sector not reaching back out to organizations like ours? So that's been really interesting to start to interface with those organizations and think about whether there are barriers in the independent school culture to doing this sort of, you don't ask the question you don't want to know. So are we asking these questions and I don't know about it in a different way? Or are we not engaging in this sort of work? Are we, I wonder, instead doing things like branding? So we tend to go to the marketing work for this sort of codifying of climate and culture. We're thinking about it in a market sense. Mm-hmm. We also tend to outsource it if we do it. So we give a high price ticket item. We buy it from a consultant instead of doing it in the context of an organization like ours that really pools data, and you're making your work more public and transparent. Mm-hmm. Part of our mission is also always close the feedback loop. So from the get-go with every partner, we talk about the data should not go into the shadows, right? Don't put it on a shelf, don't put it on a desk, don't put it on a secret server anywhere. You want that out in the world so that your community can use that as the fuel for continuous improvement.
One of the aspects of today's presentation was a belief in the power of students, of youngsters, to bring about change. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Some of the most inspiring work that I've done is with districts who, from soup to nuts, have kids in the mix. So a district in East Los Angeles, all high schools, the superintendent left it to the students to decide which survey instrument they wanted to use. Would they choose us to work with? They chose us to work with. I worked with the students. They got their community ready. So when students do this well, that means that they're doing a YouTube video to launch it out to their students saying, this data really matters. It's going to matter to our community. Please take it seriously. They're making posters with sample questions up around the school. They are cheering their classmates on as the data gets collected. And then the superintendent, who's so intrepid and so trusting of the kids in a really profound way, turns that data over to the students. We spend a day with the students doing question formulation techniques, walking them through how you read data. They're doing all of the analytics. And then this superintendent that I'm thinking of in particular had the students write portions of their accountability plan, which were then pitched up to the board, and then the board accepted it and it ended up in their state reports. So those are the instances where you can see this. It takes a lot of trust on the part of the superintendent to get those kids, let those kids actually see all that data. But in the end, it's their voice, right? They've given their perceptions of their experience in school. So you can't turn that into fuel if you don't put it in the public square.
And they're literally creating their own education.
Yeah, right. And then it's educative as well. That's exactly right. Not to mention all those great side effects, like how you understand what a median or a mean is. And
So you are a passionate advocate of data collection, of using, quantitative and qualitative
Yeah.
data. How did that start? Where is that from?
how did it start? I mean, I that's a hard question. I would say, I feel I'm very trained in it. So it's a bit of that process of you learn something and then you learn to let go of it. So I am an advocate of using evidence. And whatever evidence you use, making sure that it's tenable, it's clear, it has meaning, that it's not something that's anecdotal, so you're codifying it. But I also want to hold on to that kind of loosely as opposed to holding that really tight, because we in education have become so beholden in the last, probably 70 years to this idea like that it has to be the perfect study. And if it's not in the what works clearinghouse that the government sets up, then you can't use it as an intervention. And we've ceded our practitioner authority over to the research side of the house in a way that I think has been really counterproductive. So I want to hold all those methodologies loosely and bring them back over into the work of the school. I think we have independent schools were originally the source of the lab school. What's happened to the lab school? Like, where's that kind of part of independent school education where we're going to actually try stuff out because we don't have all of the requirements that a public school does. We have a lot of freedom. So I'm really inspired by that, which is a very progressive notion and a very progressive strand of independent school education.
So was there in your own, teaching and leadership, is there a good example of how your training, your understanding of gathering information and data changed or influenced what you were doing?
So say that again.
I'm just wondering, I'm trying to understand how you may have yourself used information that you gathered and it informed your practice and changed it.
I'm thinking of examples. So I was academic dean at Lick Wilmerding High School in San Francisco. And when student information services systems became a little more sophisticated and you were able to very easily start counting things like which groups of kids were assigned to which courses, and without saying too much, are there perverse incentives for signups for certain classes because average grades were very high? So thinking about patterns of enrollment in classes and what might be motivating students to move through the curriculum in certain ways became very interesting to me. And a lot of that was made super visible because of the ability to easily export that out of a student information system. I was also had the great privilege at the Calhoun School of being the upper school director when we moved into a mod and block-based course schedule. And there was a lot of thinking as we moved through that process, again, around how are we going to deploy resources effectively and efficiently in a very tight building. So there are all kinds of opportunities for thinking quantitatively when you're looking at scheduling systems as well that I found really interesting and I think made me effective at sorting our resources well. I'm not giving you a good example, though, about...
Those are good examples.
About,
those are great examples. If you had advice for a school leader regarding gathering information or data collection, what would it be? Where should they focus?
Yeah, so I think that the hardest part of the process is knowing what your real questions are. We think we know them. We have hypotheses that float around. Schools tell themselves stories, and we accept them. So I would suggest to anybody that they do some sort of baseline data gathering and then let the questions emerge from the data. And they might find, once they've done that sort of work, that their questions will align with the problems that they think they have, but more often than not, I think they're going to find that they have other problems, that the things that they noodle on are not necessarily the most salient problems that are facing them, or they have a slightly different twist. It's that, as I mentioned in the conversation before, like those averages. If you haven't broken down every single average of every single measure that you collect, then you don't know the stories of what's going on in your school because you haven't looked at the experience by all the different demographic groups. So I would say if you, for example, wanted to think about all of those non-cognitive factors that influence school, then doing an initial survey, having hypotheses in mind, but then being open to that emergent question that's going to come out of the data is really the critical first step.
Okay, well, I'm going to stop at that note, give you our thank you, and look forward to the rest of the presentations that you have and the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Judy.